Thank you very much, Professor, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to be part of such a distinguished panel. My history with Iran begins a quite long time ago when I was President Carter's chief domestic advisor in the White House, and we had the November '79 hostage-taking and the Iranian Revolution, which immediately preceded it, creating the first radical Islamic State dedicated and supportive of terror. This has caused one of the most profound geopolitical changes in our era, one we have lived with now for over 30 years. It's led to an existential threat to Israel, to a nuclear program that threatens to unravel the Non-Proliferation Treaty and encourage other nations in the region to go nuclear. It's involved 4 sets of UN sanctions over Iran's nuclear program, with the latest discovery only a week or two ago by the IAEA of their development of triggers, whose only use is a military application. They've developed medium and longer range missiles, which threaten not only our allies throughout the region, but also as far as the eastern parts of Europe. They're the leading state supporter of terrorist groups, which threaten the Middle East peace process, the future direction of a Palestinian state, and the unity of Lebanon. I was involved in the initial freezing of Iranian assets after the hostage-taking. I fashioned a special visa category, which President Carter approved, that allowed 50,000 Iranian Christians, Baha'is, and Jews to escape Iran and come to the United States after our consulates were initially turning them back. During the Clinton administration, as Undersecretary of State, I negotiated with the European Union on the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, and which led to a strengthening of EU dual-use exports to Iran, and was also very much involved with Secretary Albright in developing what we then call the Dialogue of Civilizations and the unilateral allowance of certain Iranian products like pistachios into the United States in the forlorn hope that it would improve relations with a relative moderate as president at the time, Khatami. Unfortunately, it did not. In private life, as the professor indicated, I'm now co-chairing for the Atlantic Council on Iran Task Force with Senator Chuck Hagel. We've been examining security threats, internal developments, sanctions, the nuclear developments, and others. I want to talk about a couple of topics dealing with the Iranian dimension of the Arab Spring and what it means for the balance of power in the region. Iran is determined to be a regional hegemon, and one of the reasons behind its nuclear power is its desire to be the top regional country, more than Turkey, more than Israel, or any other. Now, if you look at the Arab Spring from Iran's standpoint, they could see certain positive developments. For example, the turmoil in the region has allowed its nuclear program to proceed under the radar screen as the U.S. and our allies are focused very much on how to deal with the new democratic forces that have been unleashed. It now appears that they are not only developing this nuclear trigger, but they have been able to overcome the Stuxnet worm that Nancy mentioned, and their levels of uranium enrichment now exceed those before the attack. Egypt will normalize relations shortly with Iran. They've allowed Iranian warships to pass through the Suez Canal for the first time since 1979. Egypt will put less pressure on Iran's Hamas ally, indeed brokered an agreement between Hamas and Fatah, and probably put less pressure on Iran's nuclear program. The Hamas-Fatah deal, looked at from Iran's standpoint, will get their surrogate more deeply into the West Bank and potentially into the next government after the 2012 elections. The notorious Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards is, as we speak, now in Syria, helping Bashar Assad suppress the opposition through both arms and sophisticated internet blockage, just as they did to their own opposition in Iran. And this puts Iran, for the first time, squarely in a neighboring state of Israel. The negatives, on the other hand, of the Arab Spring from Iran's standpoint, I think, potentially outweigh those that are positive. For one thing, in the most broad sense, it's discredited the entire Iran and al-Qaeda model of violent revolution. Their crackdown after their June 2009 presidential elections, and more recently during the 2011 Arab Spring, was an enormous variance with the democratic movements and stirrings in the Muslim world. Their autocratic, and indeed, as Nancy mentioned, quoting the Secretary, military dictator model is the antithesis of what the Arab Spring has stood for. Their green opposition has been brutally suppressed, but still is courageous and represents a significant percentage of a well-educated Iranian public. There is indeed the most serious power struggle internally since 1979 between Ayatollah Khomeini and Ahmadinejad, with the president weakened. It's very difficult to see how this will play out, but it is relevant that with all of his rantings and all of the danger he himself provides, that Ahmadinejad did accept the agreement that was reached in Geneva for at least a first step to try to compromise on the enriched uranium issue, and was overruled by the Ayatollah. Another negative from Iran's standpoint of the Arab Spring is indeed the very unrest I mentioned in Syria, because while it has given them a temporary foothold, it has certainly threatened Assad, their key ally, and even if he survives, which is unclear, he clearly will do so in a weakened state and one in which he has much less legitimacy. It's quite interesting that Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, who's soon to be almost overwhelmingly re-elected, has been sharply critical of Assad. And indeed, I would posit to you that one of the reasons that Hamas agreed to the recent Hamas-Fatah deal that they rejected in 2009 was because of their fear that there will be a regime change in Damascus, their base, and that they will be thrown out of the country. In addition, while it is true that the democratic openings in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere may create an avenue for the Muslim Brotherhood to assert itself in ways they couldn't when American allies, autocratic though they may be, were in power, it's also true that the Muslim Brotherhood has very few relationships with Iran. The Sunni-Shiite tension is very much there. Yet another negative from Iran's standpoint is that the Arab Spring has emboldened Saudi Arabia to take a stronger stand against Iran and try to get the Arab monarchies together, Jordan, Morocco, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, in an anti-Iranian posture. Indeed, it seems that if there is a model at the end of the day for the Arab Spring, one which recognizes, for better or for worse, that there will be more Muslim influence in the political process, it is probably Turkey, not Iran. Now, again, if one looks from the U.S. perspective at the regional balance of power, the neat lineup which existed before the Arab Spring of Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries on one hand against Iran, Syria, and the terrorist groups they support on the other, This is clearly changed as if a deck of cards split evenly had been thrown up in the air, landing in unpredictable ways. Egypt is changing significantly, and we have to face that fact. There is more distance from the United States, more hostility to Israel, more championing of the Palestinian cause. The recent opening of the Rafah crossing is, along with the Hamas-Fatah pact, which they helped negotiate, clear evidence of that. That is not to say, indeed I would posit it will not be the case, that they will become an actual ally of Iran or that there will be an Islamic Republic of Egypt. Egypt is a very, very different country. But there will be a normalization of relations. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Military Council in Egypt have formed an informal alliance because I believe the military sees the Muslim Brotherhood as an ascendant force. They're likely to capture at least 30% of the vote in the September elections, and with splinter Muslim religious parties may hold close to a majority. They're the most organized. The secular groups which initiated the revolution at this point have not been able to coalesce, and the demonstrations that occur now on Tahrir Square are not the secular forces of the young people, the so-called Twitter and Facebook generation. They are the Muslim Brotherhood youth. A Muslim cleric was allowed back into Egypt for Friday prayers after 50 years. The Muslim Brotherhood is pressuring judges who are hearing cases against the former Mubarak regime. Some 500 businessmen have left. Natural gas has been cut off to Israel. Having said that, I do not believe in any way that Egypt is a lost cause. It simply will be a different country. We still have strong ties to the military. Over 50% of the senior officers of the Egyptian military were trained in the United States. They are the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid, and from their perspective, the largest recipient comes from the United States. And we still have strong trade and economic ties. With respect to the U.S. role, I believe it should be the following, and with this I'll conclude. We have lost unquestionably some influence as a result of the overturn of some of our closest allies. But we have by no means lost all influence, and I would still posit that we are the most influential of any non-Arab state. We have, for example, nothing like the east of Suez situation that the British faced after World War II, where they simply withdrew. We have strong military facilities in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, and the UAE, and Oman. We have strong and indeed enhanced defense relationships with a huge $60 billion sale with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, as I mentioned. Our economic and political levers with Egypt are quite considerable. With respect to Iraq, it is important, I hope, that we will keep a residual military presence there to keep Iran from gaining more influence. The satirists are pressuring Prime Minister Maliki to not extend in any way our presence, with some 47,000 troops still there, and I hope that the Prime Minister can be persuaded that it is important that the U.S. continue to maintain a military presence in Iraq as a way of reducing Iranian influence. With respect to Afghanistan, it is also important that we continue to maintain a strong military presence. The surge obviously has ups and downs, but it has weakened the Taliban, and a negotiated settlement will be a much better one from our perspective if we can continue to put pressure on the Taliban and their allies in every way. With respect to Iran, as everyone on this panel has been stating, it is important to strengthen the democratic opposition. It is Iran which is the terrorist state. That's where the terrorism emanates, and that's where the focus should be. The State Department, as Nancy indicated, is going through their process as the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia required them to do. And I hope that as they do so, they will expedite their decision and that they will reflect on the fact that the UK and the EU, to which I was an ambassador, have both lifted their restrictions with respect to the MEK, but the State Department, I hope, will make their decision based on the merits and to do so quickly and promptly, again recognizing the precedents that others have created. It is important that we strengthen democratic forces not only in Iran but throughout the region. This is a critical inflection point in the history of this region. And it is incredibly important that we put every resource, including the G20 pledge of $20 billion, into Egypt and Tunisia and to support the democratic forces there to make it clear that going in a more radical direction would be a subterfuge of the whole Arab Spring. What happens over the next 6 months will have meaning for decades to come, and we have to act with great alacrity. One last point. I've lived with sanctions and helped craft them during the Clinton administration. I called myself the sanctions meister during that 8-year period. There is no question that the 4 rounds of UN sanctions, together with the EU and U.S. unilateral sanctions focused specifically on the financial sector in Iran, are having an effect. They're raising the cost of the nuclear program. That, together with cyber warfare, defections, and assassinations of key scientists, have slowed but not stopped the program. And I want to associate myself with Secretary Hillen's point. There is a real economic cost. Western consumer companies are even withdrawing, even though they're not directly involved in sanctions. There's less investment in their energy area. It's very hard to insure a ship going into Iran. China is a problem, a real problem in the sanctions effort, but the sanctions are working. But it is not clear that with this regime, sanctions will be enough. It is unacceptable for this regime to have either nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons capability. And those who argue that we should simply accede to the fact that that will happen and develop the same mutually assured destruction policy that we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War do not understand that this Iranian regime is very different than the Soviet regime. They are more unpredictable, more ideological, and giving them that capability or a weapon would profoundly change the balance of power to our great disadvantage. And therefore, when we talk about every option being on the table, we need to mean that every option is on the table, because this would be an unacceptable result. Thank you very much.